Morning, kiddos. We're going to talk about the vacuum pump. Um, One of the things that you're using when you're either setting up a new piece of equipment or you're getting ready to uh, charge a system up, the vacuum pump is used for preparing the system for charging. Um, the vacuum pump is not used in the recovery process. It is not designed for recovery. Matter of fact, when it's hooked up to the system and the vacuum pump is on, it actually vents out whatever's in the system into the air. And what can we not vent to the air is refrigerant. So if there's refrigerant in the system, we cannot use a vacuum pump. The vacuum pump is not used for recovery. It cannot be used in recovery because it vents to the air. And what is one of the main things that they talk about in the EPA is no venting of refrigerant, all right? Especially regulated refrigerant. So, is this used for recovery? No, you cannot use a vacuum pump for recovery. The purpose of the vacuum pump has one, to dehydrate the system, two, to remove non-condensables in the system. Also, you can use a vacuum pump to check to see if you have a leak in the system. So, first of all, dehydrating the system. We use a vacuum pump to dehydrate the system. If you look at this container, good Lord, flask. Good Lord, I couldn't think of the name. We look at this flask, we see there's moisture in here. If we was to turn the vacuum pump on and put a deep vacuum in here, that water, the moisture in there, would start to evaporate. It will evaporate at room temperature. And that's what we're doing inside of here. If there's any moisture in here, we want to put a deep vacuum on it. So as we're evacuating, it gets vented to the air. So we lower the pressure in the system that allows the moisture to boil off at room temperature or lower, and it vents out the humidity or the moisture that may be in the system. That's dehydrating the system. We're removing the moisture from the system. How? By putting a deep vacuum on it and lowering the boiling point, which will cause it to be sucked out by the vacuum pump and put into the air. Also, we're removing any non-condensables like air or any other type of gases or nitrogen that might be in if you pressure tested it with nitrogen. So we don't want any of that stuff in here. All we want in this system, nothing but refrigerant. No air, non-condensables, no nitrogen, no moisture. We want to remove all that. So this vacuum pump is going to aid in dehydrating, removing non-condensables and other gases, but it is not used to remove refrigerant. We cannot use the vacuum pump to remove refrigerant, all right? So the vacuum pump, its primary purpose is to dehydrate, remove non-condensables, all right? But it's not used to recover. So let's talk about some of the points, some of the ways we can use a vacuum pump for leak checking or to evacuate. How do we set it up? Well, we use our manifold gauges, all right? And because we're going to be in a vacuum, we will not use the high side. High side does not have a setting. The high side does not have a setting for a vacuum. You see 0, there's nothing below that. There's no negative pressure. But the low side, if you see 0, you see, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but there's like a gold looking color right there below 0. That's vacuum. We either look at vacuum in microns or inches or mercury, or a lot of people say inches of vacuum, which is the same as the inches of mercury. All right? So a deep vacuum, what we're trying to achieve is 500 microns if we're using a micron gauge. Or if we're using these gauges, we're trying to get 30 inches of mercury or 30 inches of vacuum. That's what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to get the deepest vacuum as possible. There's no such thing as too deep of a vacuum. All right, so the blue line, pretend this, good Lord, this jar this flask, for some reason I can't remember flask. This flask is an air conditioning unit. And the blue side is for the low side, right? Remember that? So we take the blue gauges, hook up to the low side of the air conditioner, and then we take the yellow line that runs to the vacuum pump, vacuum port. We will not use the hot side, so we'll close it off. We don't even have to hook up the hot side. We'll just close it off and keep the valve closed. Also, close the low side valve right there. But we're going to use, so we're going to go from the vacuum pump through the center port, through the low side gauge side into the system. All right. So we're going to pretend to turn on the vacuum pump, and we'll let it suck out some of the air that may be in this line, and then we'll slowly open up the low side, and then you should start to see the needle drop below zero and keep going lower and lower, and we're trying to get to 30 inches of mercury, but we're not going to be able to achieve that. We're going to come close, but we cannot achieve it. So once we evacuate for a while and we get as close as we can to there, we're going to shut the valve off and turn this off, and we can literally see. You cannot get an accurate reading with this valve open. You have to literally close this valve to actually just see what the actual vacuum is. Matter of fact, when you close it, you'll see that it may go up slightly a little bit. Right? So you want to periodically open and close it to see where you're at. But to get an accurate reading, you can shut this valve, turn the vacuum pump off, and sit there for a second, and you'll see, let the needle stabilize. All right? And wait a little bit. One of the reasons why we want to wait about 5 minutes is we're trying to check to see if there's a leak. If the vacuum keeps getting, the pressure keeps getting higher and higher, keeps getting closer to zero, that means we have a leak. And the leak may be in the gauges, or it may be the system. But you need to double check your gauges first and make sure they're tight. There's, like for instance, this one would have been loose, so I would have had a leak there. Or this one here, or make sure this is here. Make sure all they are tight. Turn the vacuum pump on again. Open the valve and pull it back down to where you want it to be. And then close it, turn it off, let it stabilize, and then watch it. If it keeps climbing to zero, then we may possibly, if it's not the lines or the gauges, then it means the system probably has a leak. And we need to find that leak. And it's difficult to find the leak while it's in a vacuum. Sometimes you can hear it, but it's easier to put pressure on it with some nitrogen and take some bubbles, like some bubble spray that you can buy at an air conditioning place, and spray it and see where it bubbles at. One of the best indicators of a leak is oil spots, either on a coil or around wherever it may be leaking. It'll have some oil spots possibly. Okay, so again, we can use a vacuum pump to dehydrate the system, to remove the moisture in the system. We also use it to remove non-condensables like the nitrogen we may use to pressure test it, air, or any other type of gases. Remember, all we want in this air conditioning system is nothing but the refrigerant that we put in it. Okay? But again, if it has refrigerant in it, we cannot use the vacuum pump until we remove the refrigerant, which is the recovery machine's purpose. All right? Again, gauges can also be used to leak detect. Just as how I showed you to hook it up to the system, and watch that system over here, and watch it. If it rises within 5 minutes, then you got a leak somewhere. So you need to go back, put some more nitrogen in there, and use some bubbles, or look for some oil spots around the coils and around the lines and ever. A lot of times you can find an oil spot because there's oil in the system, and wherever there's a leak, there's usually oil finds a way to get out. Okay, so vacuum pump, do not recover refrigerant in it. If there's refrigerant in the system, do not use a vacuum pump. Use a recovery machine. Once you got it out, then you can dehydrate the system and remove the non-condensables. We can also use it as a leak detector to check the system. So when we put a deep vacuum on it, if there's a leak in there somewhere, it usually finds it. So not always, but majority of the time it can. Because sometimes when you put on a deep vacuum, it may pull something in there to seal up the crack. So that's just one way to double check to see if there's a leak in it. All right, just one way. One of the major ways of checking it is put some nitrogen and pressure it up to the limited amount of pressure you're allowed to put on the coil. Remember, a coil has a maximum pressure rating, and you should never exceed that. So nitrogen can go well above the maximum pressure rating. So that's why you have to use a regulator. So nitrogen tanks must have a regulator when you're pressure checking and checking for a leak with the system. Okay. Also, to speed up evacuating the system, you can use a bigger line with a bigger port, which will help you speed up recovery in the system. On a small appliance, that's good enough. But you may jump to a 3/8 line or a bigger, or use a vacuum port manifold, which y'all won't be exposed to right now, but that's when you're using bigger systems. Matter of fact, you may use more than one of these vacuum pumps on a manifold and hook up to the system using bigger lines, because if you got a system that can handle 100 pounds or more refrigerant, it's going to take a while if you don't put more than one vacuum pump on there, or in a big vacuum pump. So again, vacuum pump's purpose is not to recover refrigerant. Do not recover refrigerant. If there's refrigerant in it, recovery machine. If it's not, then you can use a vacuum pump to dehydrate it and remove the non-condensables. And you can also check for leaks with the gauges at the same time when you're doing the process. All right. If there's any questions, give me an email. Hopefully this was informational. One other thing I didn't mention is that the deeper the vacuum, you lower the boiling point of moisture or water. So, which means the moisture that's in the air or in this flask will boil at room temperature or lower. One of the things I used to talk about was, we're at sea level at 14.7 psi. Water boils at 212. But as you climb a mountain, the more you become above sea level, the lower the boiling point. So it may be like 190 degrees that water will boil when you're halfway up a mountain. So the less of an atmosphere, the lower the boiling point. The more of an atmosphere, the higher the boiling point. For a matter of fact, if you go below sea level, the boiling point actually goes up. Okay, so that's a pressure-temperature relationship with moisture. Remember, the deeper the vacuum, the lower the boiling point. The less of a vacuum, the higher the boiling point. So a normal 14.7 psi, water boils at 212. In here, we get it down to a vacuum of about 28, and we're looking at maybe a boiling point at maybe 50 degrees, which on a 70-degree day, that water will boil off, right? If you have any questions, give me an email. Bye.